Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. My co-host is Angelo Giuliano, and our guest today is Danny Haiphong, and we have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about the conflict in Ukraine, obviously, but also U.S.-Chinese tensions, and more specifically, this news about Huawei's Mate 60 Pro smartphone and how apparently it's made out of all Chinese components, meaning they have completely circumvented U.S. sanctions. So before we get started, welcome both of you. Welcome, Angelo. Welcome, Danny. How are you guys doing? Danny,
Doing
how are you
good.
doing? Doing
Doing
good.
doing good. Yes. Good to
Yes,
be live with
and
you all.
yes, and Angelo, how are things there? You're in Hong Kong.
Hong Kong, we had the heaviest rain in 150 years. So it was just massive. So that's the news from Hong Kong.
Okay, let's just try to stay dry. And so Danny is our guest. Where do you want to start, Danny? Do you want to start talking about Ukraine, or do you want to talk about Huawei and then US Chinese? It's all interconnected, so we could segue back and forth either way.
Yeah, maybe let's start with Ukraine.
Okay, let's see. What do I got here? How about this one from The Economist? How the Pentagon assesses Ukraine's progress. They were talking to an analyst from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, and I don't know if either one of you had a chance to read this article, but it's astounding because in the beginning of the article, they admit that they completely got Afghanistan wrong. They completely got Iraq wrong. They completely underestimated Russian defenses going into the latest Ukrainian offensive. But at this point, they're very happy that there's been this supposed breakthrough, and now they're very optimistic that they will make a full breakthrough by the end of this year. Daddy, did you get to read this article yet?
I have not, but I'm not surprised by this assessment. Especially what's so interesting about this is as there was news that there was some breakthrough in the Zaporozhye region. I know you, Brian, covered the fact that you had the British Challenger 2 burning in the same region, and at the same time you had Sergei Shoigu release data on the latest counteroffensive numbers, which point to a huge contradiction between what the collective West is saying about the long-term future of the counteroffensive and of Ukraine's prospects and the reality on the ground, which is just absolutely brutal.
Yes, and I believe the Russian Ministry of Defense said 60,000 casualties just for the offensive alone, which is a huge number of dead and injured. And even the Western media is admitting that the last of the brigades that were prepared for this offensive are involved in the fighting. They claim that they've gotten through this first line, but I don't even know what they're talking about. What line are they talking about? I think they mean the security zone. But I cannot be sure. And today I was trying to see if there was any news, because if they made the breakthrough, they must be fighting for the next position. But it seems like they're still fighting around these areas they supposedly broke through. Angela, did you get a chance to see this Economist article? There were other articles that came out after this Economist piece, like this one from Newsweek. It says Pentagon chief estimates chances of Ukrainian breakthrough by year end. I don't see that happening. Something that I was looking at was the maps of Russian defenses around Tokmak, and then if you go back to that New York Times article from December, they show layers and layers of defenses even further south between Melitopol and Crimea. So they have defenses everywhere. What makes them think that there's only 2 or 3 defenses at all, and they only need to get through another 1 or 2? Angelo.
Well, Brian, we talked about this the other day. Just think for a second. If Ukrainian forces, they would have crossed just a single line of defense, they would have put so many TikTok videos with the flag of Ukraine dancing around and just partying. We haven't seen anything. Have you seen the defense line? No, we didn't. We didn't because there was no breakthrough. they're still in a gray area, or they just close by. And I think this is what the economist is doing here is what we call in French the méthode Coué. Coué was a doctor that actually was teaching his patients that you have to do self-suggestion. The more you repeat lie to yourself, you are going to believe it. So you look at yourself in the mirror and you say, I'm a beauty, I'm a beauty. And at the end of the day, you believe it. And that is what is happening with Ukraine. I just want to point out, did you see the interview, Claire Daly? Claire Daly, she was actually asking Jens Stoltenberg, and she was saying there are 500,000 casualties, Ukrainian casualties, and Jens Stoltenberg, he didn't deny it. He said, "Well, that's a heavy price, yes, but that's war," something like this. But what I'm saying is that slowly, I think they are going to expose what the reality on the ground, the reality that we've been telling on your channel, and you've been telling also on your own. About the reality on the ground, heavy losses. It's just a butchery, and the problem is that you have two different ways of doing the war. One is the war of perception, that's the TikToker videos and just playing on the emotional side, and one is very pragmatic, the long-term game, and that's the Russian side. And again, what is interesting is that if you look at the Russian perspective, they have the Ukrainians where the Russians want them to be. The Russians want to be behind heavily fortified lines on the defense with artillery superiority, air superiority, and you just let them come. So what happened when it's like this? Well, you have a very high casualty on the Ukrainian side. And that's playing in the hand of the Russian side, because what Russian side wants to do is demilitarization. It's a war of attrition, and sadly, it's about killing Ukrainian soldiers.
Yes, and Danny, I wanted to ask you why do you think the West is compelling Ukraine to do this if it really is just feeding their and you even saw some Western commentators, pro-Ukrainian Western commentators, saying we should stop this now. Even that delusional general who said that they might win by 2025, even he said at least stop the offensive now because it's not going to accomplish anything. Why do you think there's this impetus to continue anyway?
I think the United States and its collective West vassals are really backed into a corner here. I mean, you have Joint Chiefs of Staff head Mark Milley also saying similar things throughout the duration of the conflict since November of 2022. Maybe it's time to stop. Maybe it's time to freeze the conflict. You even have Biden saying this at times. But I think being backed into a corner is very difficult for the collective West as a whole. And that it's basically been a combination of these admissions. We've seen it just over and over and over again, admitting that the counteroffensive is stalled, it's slow. Maybe there needs to be a freeze in the conflict because progress is not occurring in the way that the collective West had hoped or wanted it to, or maybe was hoping to wish into existence. You know, there's this term, this almost new age term that younger people use, but really people all across the board in the United States use. They call it manifesting. It's this idea that if you just think hard enough, similar to what Angela was saying earlier, if you just think it hard enough, if you just want it enough, then you will meet your lifestyle goals or your personal goals, your economic goals. And I think here we see a lot of that going on with the United States, that they are backed into a corner. The entire collective West is in Ukraine, and they can't get out of this corner. They know where this conflict is going. They know it regardless of how long it is prolonged, no matter how long it goes, that Russia has the advantages. It's similar to other wars that the United States has fought in this way. It's you go to another region of the world, you attempt to oppress and to get your way, interfere in affairs. And generally, even if you experience some short-term gains, long-term, people are going to resist. And Russia is just a different kind of adversary. It's a different kind of target. it's just not working out in the way that they had hoped. Really, I believe that with all of the miscalculations, from the economic war to the differences in the actual output that the United States and NATO could put forth in this conflict versus what is actually possible, all these miscalculations are a product of an underestimation of Russia's ability to defend itself and its ability to fight back. And so I think that a big reason for this is that if there is going to be any change in the conflict, the United States needs to ensure that it isn't total Russian victory. So it is just all about prolonging, and it's also about keeping the cycle of war profiteering going, because this conflict is immensely profitable no matter the results of it. As long as it's able to keep going, there's at least that prospect for military contractors to continue to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze more and more federal contracts out of the Biden administration and maybe whoever ends up president in 2024. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that those contracts continue. And so the United States at various points needs to project this positivity, this like false positivity about the conflict in order to keep it going. But it isn't going to go well regardless. This is going to be the trajectory. I mean, when Russia says it's going to do something, it happens. And we saw this with the Challenger 2 and the Leopard tanks and all these burning tanks on the battlefield. Russia said immediately in January, when these were committed, that they're going to burn in the battlefield. And that's exactly what's happened. Russia has made its aims clear. And while it doesn't project them, or forecast them months into the future, every time Russia says it's going to do something, it happens. With Ukraine, it's always speculation. And this Zaporozhye region breakthrough is another similar point. It's trying to bring some kind of positivity into a completely and utterly pessimistic situation for the collective West prospects.
Yeah, and they admit that they underestimated. Well, some people are admitting that they underestimated Russia, but then they continue to do it. They just create the next narrative where they are completely what makes them think that if they underestimated Russia up until this point, they're going to actually make this breakthrough and achieve the goals of the Ukrainian offensive at this point, after exhausting their offensive potential. But Danny, you spoke in front of the UN Security Council about this pumping of weapons into Ukraine and how this is not going to bring peace. This is going to obstruct any sort of peace or negotiation in Ukraine. You talked about different weapons and the different kinds of consequences. Well, here are some more weapons going to Ukraine. And this isn't anything new, because depleted uranium rounds went in with the British Challenger 2 tanks. And here is the United States sending depleted uranium rounds with their M1 Abrams. I think a maximum of 30 will be sent. There's only something like 10 that are being prepared right now. In total, eventually there will be 30. I mean, I already said these are going to end up burning just like everything else on the battlefield. We all said this months and months ago. Russia, like you said, Danny, pointed this out. You go through this article. This is the point I want to make, and then I want to hear everybody's opinion on this. They're trying to downplay the danger of depleted uranium, and they do it in a very sneaky way. They say, depleted uranium really isn't that radioactive, and if you're exposed to it, if you're like sitting next to a DU round, you're not just going to go and get cancer like if you were sitting in a, swimming in a nuclear reactor pool or something. But the thing that makes depleted uranium dangerous is not its radioactive nature. It is also toxic, highly toxic. When you fire a round, it bursts into dust, and people inhale that dust. It enters into the environment. It enters into the water and the food supply, and people are ingesting it, and it is toxic, and that is what's dangerous. And I even have this from the US government's National Institute for Health talking about the toxicity of depleted uranium. So the US is just blatantly lying about this. I wanted to hear your take on this, Danny, and then Angela, I'd like to also hear what you think about this.
Well, it's disastrous. I mean, Fallujah, 2004, the U.S. raided that city, destroyed that city, used depleted uranium rounds, and now cancer rates in Fallujah up until this day are astronomical. And so the correlation between cancer and other kinds of health issues with depleted uranium are very clear because of these exact effects that you outlined and how they are used and what happens after these rounds are used. But one thing I want to point out here is oftentimes the collective West, what they will do, and especially the mainstream media, you can look at the US mainstream media around this announcement, and you will see over and over and over again, whether it's in the headline or in the content of the articles, what they will presume is that Russia also uses depleted uranium rounds. And what they'll say is that they possess them. And in each and every article, you will find, and I know you do a lot of this, Brian, looking into these articles and seeing what they actually say. So when they say that Russia has depleted uranium rounds, they always couch it and follow up with the statement that it is not clear whether these are used in Ukraine. Russia has never verified this. This has not been verified on the battlefield, but yet you've seen over and over and over again, whether it's through headlines and articles, a suggestion that Russia's hypocritical for criticizing the use of depleted uranium. So all of this is meant to try to paint Russia as the villain here when it is the United States that is going against what is a material, a substance used in warfare that is condemned by over 100 countries in the world, and that actually, no, I'm getting confused with cluster munitions. But depleted uranium has a long history from Iraq to Yugoslavia as being absolutely detrimental to the health and safety of people. And it does have radioactive consequences. But we know that the United States does not care about this. They're using cluster munitions, as I said, which have been condemned by over 100 countries in the world. These munitions still explode in Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia to this day. So, in effect, this just shows how low the United States is willing to go to prolong this conflict, because it won't change anything. There's nothing about using depleted uranium rounds that will change anything except escalate with Russia and cause devastating environmental consequences, not just to Russians on the battlefield, not just to the Russian army on the battlefield, but it will cause long-term consequences for people in Ukraine and for the Ukrainian forces that are either going to be slaughtered or poisoned by these materials, because this is what happens in warfare. It's not just those who these weapons target that are affected. It is also the very forces that you are deploying to fight these wars. We've seen this in Vietnam, for example, where many U.S. soldiers to this day are not only traumatized by going and invading another country like Vietnam, but they're still feeling the effects of things like Agent Orange, and U.S. soldiers who were deployed to Fallujah feeling the effects of being exposed to that level of toxicity from depleted uranium. So on and on and on. The consequences always backfire. And in this case, given just how high the casualties are for Ukraine, given how low the prospects are for victory, adding another weapon like this into the mix is just meant to provoke and escalate with Russia. It has absolutely no other utility than that. It's not going to change anything. So this really does show the inhumanity of it all. There's no factoring in what could be the consequences, not just for Russian forces, but also for Ukrainian forces and anyone else, all these foreign mercenaries, anyone who's being thrown into the line of contact.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize something you said. It's going to be the civilians in the areas where these weapons are used that are going to suffer the most and the longest, because when the conflict is over, the soldiers are gone, and it's going to be the people living in these areas. And before we get Angelo's take, someone is asking why do militaries use depleted uranium? They're making a tank shell using depleted uranium because it is an incredibly dense metal. And if your tank shell that you're firing at another tank, it's denser than the armor of that tank, it has a more likelihood of passing through the armor. the thing about depleted uranium, though, is that there's so many other ways of doing this. You have all of these different types of armor that tanks are now equipped with. You have RPGs, these rocket-propelled grenades, very simple weapons that can go through almost anything. And so it's an older approach. And the U.S. just has a bunch of these laying around. So they say, just send it to Ukraine. We have them sitting around. Who cares about the civilians? Who cares about the Ukrainians in these tanks when they blow up? And if they manage to survive, they're going to be inhaling all of this DU. The armor is reportedly, well, I don't know if Ukraine's going to get DU armor. There's a top secret armor the M1 Abrams and the Challenger 2 has, and it's rumored that depleted uranium plays a role in that. I don't know if they're going to get any of those. But anyway, Angela, what do you think about all of this?
I'm actually surprised that the Western media, they're not coming up with a theory that depleted uranium from the US is actually not toxic. I'm actually surprised. I mean, the same as did you see the nuclear waste in Fukushima? All the collective West is closing an eye just because Japan is a vassal state.
Yes.
I just want to point out one thing about where are those depleted uranium ammunitions being used. They're used in Russian population territory. Just think about long term, those wasteland, those land which will be contaminated will be long term where Russia probably will take back, because those are Russian populated territory. So that is maybe one of the reasons that they're using that. I would be, if it was this in Lvov, fights in Lvov and, the core of those Ukraine Nazis land places, I think it would be different. They would think twice, because you want to protect the land you're living in. Why would you, just think for a second, why would you use depleted uranium on the land that you are going to be that you cherish? Because ultimately, you know what? I think they do not cherish that land. Ask yourself one question. They are focusing on going towards Crimea, and they're not focusing on taking back the Donbass. Why? Very simple. Because NATO wants Crimea. Crimea is so important for NATO, it would cut the access to warm seas to Russia. If they were caring so much about the Donbass, the other regions, they would go there, right? But they don't care. They actually that shows us clearly that they are fighting the NATO war. And this is NATO's interest. Crimea is for NATO. It is not for Ukraine. And actually, at the end of the day, we need to keep on repeating, because nobody talks about this. But those lands controlled by Russia that went back to Russia officially and legally, people do not want to be part of Ukraine. And this is why I think I'm not sure if it was Indonesia, but they asked for a referendum control in those lands, meaning, like internationally controlled. I think it wouldn't be a bad thing that we have a referendum just to show them, well, that is the reality. Because ultimately, I mean, why would you want those lands where, 90% of those people don't want to go back to Ukraine? Why would you want to do that when you are advocating self-determination? It's okay for Kosovo, but it's not okay for other places.
That's a very good point. That actually leads us to this. Here's the U.S. State Department complaining about elections being held in the new oblasts of the Russian Federation. And the title is Russia's Sham Elections in Ukraine's Sovereign Territory. And this was September 7, 2023. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken complaining about this. Just think about what the United States is saying. They're the ones who overthrew an elected government in 2014. They installed extremists into power who ran the opposition out of the country, purged them from Ukrainian politics. And from that point onward, all Ukraine had was sham elections. And we're not even getting into the other countries the U.S. invaded occupied and then held sham elections in. Danny, where do you want to start with this?
Well, I mean, this report comes as the United States literally visits Jake Sullivan. I mean, Antony Blinken was just there twisting Ukraine's arm and saying, well, this is where things need to go. And oh, here's some extra money to keep you loyal, extra arms to keep you loyal. But even before that, around the time of, around the weeks leading into Alexei Reznikov's resignation, Jake Sullivan was there essentially saying, clean up your corruption or, things might get tighter leading into a presidential election coming up. And what did Ukraine do? Well, they tightened up and fired Alexei Reznikov for all of the corruption that has been going on. And corruption that was caused, exactly as you said, Brian, by this coup in Ukraine, which completely destabilized Ukrainian politics, essentially rendered it under the control of the United States and NATO. And what did they do? Well, they created all of these fake institutions to assert its power, to dominate Ukraine, and to use the most corrupt elements from oligarchs like Poroshenko and Kolomoisky. And then you also have, of course, the far right neo-Nazi nationalist elements that they have used not only militarily, but also politically to get their way and to build up an anti-Russia political project, which was always meant to bring conflict to Russia. That is why Ukraine was shelling Donbass all of those years. It wasn't just to get rid of the ethnic Russians and the various forces in the Donbass resisting such a thing, the so-called rebel groups, the People's Republic of Donetsk, etc. It wasn't just getting rid of those forces that were standing up to the shelling, but it was to bring war to Russia's border. And this was always communicated by Russia very clearly that this is a red line. And so the fact that the United States now wants to lecture Russia for taking political steps toward not only securing its sovereignty, but also toward helping the people in the Donbass who in large majorities vote in favor of joining the Russian Federation, which is their sovereign right. It's their right of self-determination. The fact that the United States is lecturing Russia for simply going forward with steps that it probably should have taken in 2014 when the coup happened. And Vladimir Putin himself has said it was regrettable that further action wasn't taken years before. The fact that they're doing it now and they're being lectured and insulted and degraded for this kind of activity is not just hypocritical, but it really does show how the United States has one agenda, and that is using any means of propaganda, of information warfare to undermine what happens all across the world when it comes to steps towards sovereignty. Every time a country takes a step, every time a people takes a step toward true sovereignty, we're hearing now Niger, Russian officials are saying that in Niger, the United States is possibly thinking about, through various intelligence that they've conducted, assassinating Niger's new leadership. And this, of course, as you said, Brian, this wouldn't go against what the United States has done all across the world since 1945 and even before that, which is do anything politically, militarily, and economically to get their way, to dominate other countries, and to force countries and people to enact economic and military policies that favor the United States at the expense of these nations, at the expense of their people.
Yes, and the U.S. doesn't even care how inconsistent or hypocritical it comes across as. They just don't care. They just, whatever they need that day, they will do it. They don't even care or seem even aware of what they said the day before. Angela, what do you make of all of this? Oh, Angela, you're muted.
Sorry, guys. I get very frustrated when they put the car before the horses, because what is the most important by far is sovereignty. You don't even talk about democracy if there is no sovereignty. So they keep on hammering, oh, we want you to have democracy and so on and so on. But if you don't have sovereignty, how can you have a democracy? Well, that is the idea they have. I subvert your democracy. I meddle into your country. You don't have any more sovereignty, and then because I'm going to control the game, then I can push for that democracy. And I think all fight in general, it's all about sovereignty. We don't even need to talk about ideology, left, right, whatever. It's not important at all. If we do respect people for every single country, it doesn't matter. Afghanistan, they choose Taliban. Who the F am I at the other side of the world to let those people, to let them know what is good for them? They know better their own reality. So our fight is only about sovereignty. So whenever they because that's what we get always from the US, the collective West. They say they start the talk about democracy. That's what we need to go. The direction we need to go is sovereignty. First question: is it a sovereign state? And you ask the questions, and you see those African countries. Why sovereignty doesn't make any sense? But you have US troops in Nigeria. You have French troops in Nigeria. You have a dozen countries in Africa that use money printed by France. And that's the foundation. That's the core of what we are doing. That's the most important, because ultimately, once there's sovereignty, then it's done. All work is done because they do their own business. That is their home. And I think what we need to point out is those discrepancies. This, those I don't know, just discrepancies. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. We are in the contradictions. That's the word.
Yeah.
Those contradictions, because we are so full of contradiction. Plus, I mean, we don't even have democracy at home. I mean, how absurd is that? We have our system is not working, and we want to export it. Our system in the US, how many people they trust the Congress and the political system? It's probably around 30%. Max, I don't know. Danny, maybe you know better than I do. But why would you want to export a system where most of the people are unhappy, unsatisfied?
Yeah, well, Congress is even lower than that. I think overall trust in the government hovers around 30+%, and then the president usually hovers somewhere between 40 and 50%, depending on how bad it gets. I think Biden has actually at some points pulled below the 40% mark in approval rating, but Congress, in terms of trust in Congress, is somewhere 13% generally. It fluctuates, but 13%. I mean, this is considered by some who I think might get this wrong. They believe that Congress is the most powerful and influential political body in the United States with the most checks and balances within it. Of course, I believe that elites, corporate elites, and militarist elites are actually the ones that control the government. So Congress is dictated by them. However, there are many in the United States who believe that Congress is the most democratic body. It's the body that has the most checks and balances. However, this body is also one of the least trusted because as you said, discrepancy, the contradiction, the gap between how far off U.S. policy is toward the interests of people and the illusion of democratic mechanisms like Congress. The gap between the two means that people trust it even less because they expect more. They expect when they elect representatives and they all come together in Senate or the House that they will pass legislation that benefits them, and then it never happens. And that's why people start to distrust it heavily. And that's the situation they're in. So yeah, it's completely egregious and ridiculous and really a joke. I mean, the United States is really the clown show of the world at this point. And it really is a joke to lecture Russia about taking these kind of steps and doing so probably, even though the UN, dominated by the US, will not acknowledge the referendums. Despite that, this is the most democratic process, the way to go if you are going to do something like incorporate regions of border regions, whatever, into your country. This is the way you do it. There really is no other way, regardless of what you think of what happened within that mechanism. The United States has a long history of not doing this, of not asking nicely. It didn't ask Mexico nicely. It didn't ask the Philippines nicely. It certainly didn't ask Hawaii nicely, which is now going through this this awful tragedy, this wildfire tragedy. But it didn't ask any of these regions of the world nicely. What it did is it invaded, it went in, it planted its flag, it militarily invaded, colonized, and then looted, plundered, and of course enacted immense suffering on the populations. So the United States has a long history of doing far worse than this, but yet still finds it unironic to condemn Russia for doing something that had no bloodshed at all, which is hold referendums where 90+% of people in places like Donetsk said we want to join the Russian Federation.
Danny, just one question. Well, you talk to people in the US. I mean, how people explain, I'm not for the left or right, I really don't care about this, but how people that actually support Biden, they explain that they are supporting someone that is senile. Why Biden has more than 0%? I'm not even talking about 10%. 10% is too much already, because you have a senile. And I mean, I have the impression, because it's so divided, they know that on their side they have a clown, but at least it's my clown. I don't want the other clown, right? But at least it's mine. It's mine. It has, it's like your baby is a criminal. He's killed 10 people, but it's my baby. How do you explain? Do you point out this problem? And not only that, you can become senile during your term, but if you are running for another term, then you know what? Someone has to come out, even within their own rank. Why don't have, even on the Democratic Party, someone saying, what the F are we doing? Is senile is not there, and we're looking stupid.
Yes. Well, Angela, you bring up many good points. And earlier, when you were referencing kind of the ideological spectrum and, how you yourself are, left and right, it doesn't matter. What happens in the United States, I think, and in people, let's say in my immediate circle, it also really doesn't matter, because what ends up happening is in the US political system, you have such an intense level of misinformation and also such an intense level of pushing people towards seeing that there's only two political parties that are possible, and you have to kind of choose a team, choose a side, despite the fact that whichever side you choose, your interests are not going to be met. Your lives are likely not going to improve. And honestly, I think the vast majority of people understand that their conditions, the conditions that they live in, are actually going to worsen regardless of who is president, which is why you see things like low voter turnout numbers and, of course, growing distrust in these government institutions, including the commander-in-chief, whose approval rating, Biden's, and regardless of whoever it is, it usually fluctuates quite dramatically over the course of the administration. But it never reaches the point of, let's say, of Vladimir Putin in Russia, which has 70+%, even in wartime, 70+% support of people. And we can go across the board around the world in countries that are often demonized, and you'll see trust in government, like China, for example, is quite high. So in the United States, like for people in my immediate circle, what I see and how this is often talked about is in a number of ways. You have, of course, the diehard liberal class, which has honestly fully embraced neoconservatism in foreign policy at this point. And that was a concerted project since the Project of a New American Century was announced. And the neocons went full force with that beginning in the War on Terror. But the opinion of the liberal class is, well, the Democrats are, that's it. They're it. We actually do not care or don't even choose to look into what is the actual record of these presidents. Usually they'll hold on to some kind of niche issues where the Democrats and Republicans feign disagreement and say, well, on these issues, the Democrats are better, so I'm going to support. For example, reproductive rights. They'll say, reproductive rights, the Democrats say they support it, even though Biden has a long history of opposing it. So we're not going to vote for Republicans. So that's kind of how the game is for the liberal class. But then for a lot of people, actually, and even for some folks in this class, there is this acknowledgement that Biden is senile, that Biden is having many issues, just the way he looks, the way he talks. He's walking away from podiums. He's shaking hands with air. You know, there's all kinds of things that are just right in front of us to see, that it's hard to deny. And I think for many people, for example, that I know who, let's say, don't really care about politics, they understand this. But at the same time, they're either going to not vote or just hold their nose for Joe Biden, because what ends up happening is the default. Trump or the Republicans are viewed as the greater evil, and the Democrats are the lesser of two evils. So politics in the United States is really a sham in terms of it being some kind of democratic process. There really is no democracy. People either feel like they are beaten down to the point where they have to hold their nose for any one particular candidate and hold their nose for a declining president like Joe Biden, or they feel like there are no prospects at all. And so I think when you have that political environment, it's not hard to see why people, let's say in the liberal class, neocons, and even many on the right who like Joe Biden, many on the traditional right, on the Bush era folks, the intelligence spooks, all of these forces, they like someone like Joe Biden because he just does whatever they want him to do. So when you have a political environment where you have these contending interests and you have just a mass of population that only sees hopelessness in their system and only sees two options that aren't going to work for them, then you are going to have many people just do what has been expected all this time. But that is breaking. I mean, the United States is becoming ever more divided, polarized, and I think that more and more people are beginning to look into other alternatives or just completely detached from the system itself. So Biden's senility has definitely played a role in this, because this is years in the making now. He's been president for almost a full term. And a lot of people, even people that don't care about politics, see this. You see the memes, you see the videos go viral on social media. It is not a secret that Joe Biden is just not the most functional bulb in the bunch right now. And so that's kind of how people talk about it. That's really how people do talk about it. They joke about it, but they throw up their hands and say, well, this is what we got.
Yeah, I would say that in America, I think the largest voting bloc are people who don't vote at all. And then you have people who are just voting for one person because they hate the other person more. And that's how your system is totally dysfunctional. But I want to go back to something that Angela was saying about how the system doesn't work in the US. For the people, it absolutely does not work for the people. It is a failed system in that sense. But as a system of control to keep people divided and distracted, it is very efficient. It is very functional. And then why do they want to export it? Because it is a means of imposing US influence on another country. They know they can manipulate that country if it adopts Western style democracy, just like they can control it inside the US itself. So it is the modern day empire. This is the structure that they use to control it, to control people, both within the empire and in places where they're trying to impose it. Does anyone else have anything they want to say about Ukraine? Or we're going to be talking about the dysfunction within the United States here when we move on to China and especially Huawei. But if you have anything you want to say about Ukraine, one last thing, and if not, we could go to this article from the Washington Post. This one right here. New phone sparks worry. China has found a way around U.S. tech limits. And I'm sure that both of you have seen this story, maybe not this particular article. This article actually makes a lot of good points. they're basically saying China has found a way around this. The U.S. is investigating it. I don't think anyone has all the answers as to how China was able to do this, although we could get into that a little bit more in just a minute. But they admit that the sanctions from the very beginning, and this is something that I had said years ago when they were talking about putting these sanctions and destroying Chinese progress in terms of semiconductors. I said it would not work. It could not work. And all they're going to do is hurt themselves. And this was something that I heard Alex Christoforou say in a recent video about this. He said, everything that you can say about Huawei and China circumventing these sanctions and it blowing up in America's face, just copy and paste it in regards to Western sanctions on Russia. And down here, they actually are quoting people from the US chip industry. And they're saying, these sanctions prevented us from selling our products in China. So that's a huge market share that we have lost. That means lost revenue. That means less revenue for research and development, which means we are going to end up actually falling behind. So as China is circumventing sanctions and investing in semiconductor production, we are losing because we are losing revenue for research and development. So it's propelling China forward, and it is dragging the U.S. into the abyss. Danny, what do you think about all of this?
Well, I was reading Chinese media today, and there was a report in CGTN talking about how 1,000 scientists and researchers have signed a letter led by 2 particular scientists working at Stanford, saying that the United States needs to curb these sanctions and export controls and bans, etc., because of exactly what you pointed out, Brian, that it is cutting off not just the market for US high technology in China, but it's also the consumer market, but it's also cutting off these scientists from being able to make the progress that they want to make in advancing this kind of technology. So the United States is falling behind because of this. And that is clear to see. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which I often talk about, has this high technology tracker where they have sounded the alarm saying that China has surpassed the United States in 37 of 44 advanced technologies, and that the gap within these advances that China has made over the United States is growing, and China is also moving forward, including on advanced semiconductor chips, toward overtaking the United States in these areas. And so it's not hard to see, even though we don't know the exact details, why Huawei was able to overcome these challenges posed by sanctions. When I was in China, people were telling me that the Huawei Mate phone that came right before the Pro 60, that the 60 Pro, that didn't have 5G technology in it. And there was this huge gap between the second oldest phone and then this phone, where the phone before it had 5G. And so that phone wasn't really selling. So it did have an impact on Huawei's consumer market. And so it's not hard to understand why Huawei and other Chinese tech companies have been working incredibly hard to find these advances, find ways to so-called circumvent the sanctions, which really, if we look at a phone like Huawei Mate Pro 60, we know that how they were able to do it was they increased their research and development. They increased the intensity of their production. They moved as fast as they could to become self-reliant in these areas. And also, we have to factor in, I believe, the fact that something like an export ban and investment bans and these kind of things, they take some time to implement. So you have South Korea, for example, and Japan nod their head saying, yes, we will follow along on these technology bans and controls on China. But then you also have the meeting with China talking about expanding cooperation. South Korea was doing that in Indonesia this week, talking about how cooperation between China and the U.S. and China and South Korea needs to expand. And so it's my estimation that while these export bans have had and these sanctions have had an impact on Huawei and Chinese tech as a whole, these countries that are being browbeaten and bullied into following U.S. diktats, cannot simply just cut off entirely their trade with China. And so I think that gave China some time to make these advances as fast as they could. And it's shocking, I think, to the collective West and the United States in particular, only because the United States doesn't really pay attention or ignores the fact that sanctions against countries like Russia and China are incredibly ineffective, that these countries have higher capacities to reorient their economies to their benefit than maybe others might. But even smaller countries have also been able to circumvent sanctions to a great degree in order to survive and continue operating politically and economically in a sovereign manner. So sanctions usually don't bring down a country. And often what they do is they consolidate that country's political system. We can see that in Venezuela. We can see that in Syria. People are not going to oppose their government just because of sanctions. That's the hope and the aim. The hope and the aim is that these countries will overthrow their governments because they're suffering so badly. But usually people suffer, and they also understand where that suffering is coming from. So they consolidate around their governments, and they demand and hope that their governments will do the right thing and do their best to circumvent and oppose these sanctions. And China is probably example number one, the top example of how sanctions backfire and eventually lead to accelerating this process of leaving the United States behind in all areas. And technology is maybe one of the biggest, given that as China continues to progress in this area, it starts to go toward Russia and say, hey, Russia, you want to come with us? Like, you want to be high-tech hubs together? Hey, the rest of the world, do you want to come with us and, share in this progress? And the United States ends up being on the outside looking in, hoping to destroy the planet as fast as possible to arrest this progress.
Yeah, and as you were saying that, I was putting this up on the screen, and Angela and I, we always go to this and talk about this. You were talking about all of these countries and areas that are being pressured to cut business with China. And well, Taiwan is not a country, but South Korea is. And both in terms of exports and imports, China is their biggest trade partner. Japan, the country that people think is going to, go to war with China, but their largest trade partner in both terms of imports and exports is China. And so I think they realize where their future lies, and they realize that pressure on them to work contra to China, to create problems with China, that is actually going against their own best interests. It's not just helping the US against China, who they perceive as a threat. They don't see China as a threat. They're being coerced to do this. So that is a very good point. So one other thing they were talking about in that article, that Washington Post article, and other people have been analyzing this, they've talked about how watching what the US has done to try to smother China, weaponizing semiconductors and withholding them from China, many other countries started asking themselves, well, if they're doing it to China today, maybe they'll do it to us tomorrow. It was the exact same process that many countries went through when they were watching the US and the EU sanction Russia, especially Saudi Arabia. They said, well, if they're going to put a price cap on Russia today, maybe it'll be us tomorrow. So that was actually a driving motivation to pivot Saudi Arabia and Turkey away from the West toward the East. India, which is actually I think they're going to rename themselves, if someone wants to talk about that, maybe Bharat, I think. And again, why are they doing this? Just like Myanmar went from Burma to Myanmar, just to throw off the colonial legacy. They were trying to play both sides. They wanted to do business with both sides, but because of the desperate nature of Western sanctions and coercion, they're actually pushing these countries away, and they end up isolating themselves further. Now, Angela, I know you know a lot about this. Plus, you're also actually in China. You're in Hong Kong. So maybe you could give us a little bit more insight into all of this.
For the chip industry, or?
Yeah, yes, especially about the chip industry and what China is doing to overcome these sanctions. They're trying to isolate China from getting access to technology and components. So now China is working on doing that indigenously.
Yeah, but just the idea of containment, that shows clearly that you are weaker. You are weaker, and the only way you can slow down the process is by playing games that are, not fair games. I saw a tweet by Andy, your friend Andy Borham, and he said that that's pretty much the same as Tonya Harding. Remember that skater? They blew up the kneecap of a competitor because she was afraid she could not compete, and that's what the collective West is doing. The problem is that we mentioned this many times over. China has a population which is much larger, but also the percentage of STEM graduate. This is a very interesting graph. You see this graph here. We are seeing that China has 4.7 million STEM graduates. So STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Okay, look at where the US is, 568,000. But even that figure, there's probably 40 to 50% of those STEM graduates that are foreigners. And half of those foreigners, do you know where they come from? From China. So they have roughly only 300,000 STEM graduates compared to 4.7 million. Additional to that, when you are in China, China is putting so many funds into research and development. This is state funds. That, of course, everything is going to go faster. You can, and just efficiency, productivity, efficiency. Also, $1 spent in China is worth much more than what you spend when you spend it in the US. Lately, these days, there's a Reuters article that you were showing just before. China is just issuing a paper for funding $40 billion in the chip industry, and this is actually it's in response to the Chip Act from the US. The US has issued a paper which is an investment of I think it's over $50 billion dollars. But again, I would trust in terms of action. I would trust more the Chinese than the US. I mean, we saw what happened with Build Back Better, right? It was only words. I don't know what's going to happen with this, but also where it becomes a problems with the allies of the US. What we call they gave themselves a name, the Chip Alliance, which is the US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. They align against China. But the problem is that by doing this Chip Act, the US is actually going to attract their competitors to invest in the chip industry in the US. So the same as they disindustrialize Europe and Germany, and so you have companies in Germany that are moving to the US is trying to do the same thing with the chip industry. So this is why the Koreans, they're saying, yes, we are going to do something against China. We're not going to sell them anything. But you know what? Differentiate words from actions. Because again, they cannot destroy their own industry. Samsung, they have their own factories in China. I mean, it's a suicide. You see, there's one thing which was very interesting that happened these days. The Chinese government, they said a civil servant in China cannot have an iPhone. I don't know the amount. We're talking about millions of people. The Apple stock went down. How many percent? I think it was 200. The value of $200 billion evaporated just because of the big drop. And this is a small thing that China did. What happens is that you see the same as the collective West use all their weapons with Russia, and they're using pretty much everything they can with China. See how Russia and China are strong. They have weapons that they haven't used yet. Now, with the ban of Apple for civil servants in China, they're giving us just a small taste. That single action, they made the stock of Apple to lose 200 billion valuation. Because, of course, I mean, Apple market, let's imagine if tomorrow Apple is completely banned from China. It's over. It will be over. But they're not going to do that. China, they're playing the long game. They want to play fair game. Same as Russia. Russia is not aggressive because you know what? After war, there's going to be peace. You know what? One day, Putin will have to still sit down with those clowns, with the Macron, with Scholz. He will have to sit down, and it's okay. Do you know why? Because he's working for his country. It's not about ego here. Well, China, they know that they have in front of them they have clowns, but the advantage is China is playing the long game. There's no constraint of election cycles. In China, they're working for the next generations. That's what in the West we should start thinking, because we don't have project of society. What do we want to build in terms of society for the next generation, for all kids? Just that single sentence, that's inspiring, because imagine you are working towards a society for the next generation. In the West, no, it's election cycles. It's tomorrow.
And profit.
And profit. Yeah, you see, difference, profit-driven, purpose-driven. Same as the army, the US Army, profit-driven, not purpose-driven. Purpose. In China, it's purpose-driven. And it's not only words. Xi Jinping, he said clearly, there were some measures related to the inflation, to the bubble of housing. He said, you know what? Housing is not for speculation. Housing is for people to live in. The market crash, that's okay. You were doing speculation on the first, so and I think the long term there is going to be redistribution of wealth. This is unavoidable in China. Deng Xiaoping in 1979, when there was an opening of China, he said, let's make a small proportion of people to make money. That's okay. But the long-term game would be, long-term, we are going to still going towards this redistribution. I don't like to use the socialist, communist terms and so on. I think it's much more attractive when we say redistribution of wealth, more equitable. That's the thing. We need to avoid those terms, really. And once you hear that, let's say in the US, Peter, average Joe will be like, redistribution of wealth. That's attractive. Then if you say communist, you say that, wah!
They see your shirt, Angela.
They see your shirt.
This is not CCP. It's CC. It's the Russian.
CCP. Yes.
No, but like in the collective West, in the West, average Joe is like communist, like reptilian mind. His reptilian mind is like blocking. It's like, oh my God. Oh my God. It's like he relates that to Nazism and so on. And that's what people should do. You should use terms that redistribution of wealth, and that is much more attractive. Because keep in mind, we are the 99% against the 1%. And it doesn't matter. The rest is all cosmetics,
Yes. So I have a question for both of you. Why, obviously the US, along with the EU, put sanctions on Russia and it blew up in their face. They isolated themselves. They have made Russia stronger. They have now done the same thing to China. We just looked at the number of STEM graduates per year. China is graduating millions more than the US every year. And that's only going to increase as time goes on. So what, the US is a smaller country. It will have a smaller economy. It will have a smaller military. Proportionately, it should have less influence and less power around the globe, and most certainly less power and influence in Asia. It's not even located in Asia. And yet the people in Washington and the people on Wall Street who drive the policy in Washington, for some reason, they cannot let this go. And why is that? And I would speculate and say that they believe they're superior. They believe that it doesn't matter that there's less of them. China has a bigger economy, bigger industrial base. Doesn't matter. Chinese people are inferior to the West, and their natural place is subordinated to the West. And this is a mindset that has stretched generations. And I believe it's still very prevalent today. And I believe it's not that they inherently cannot understand that this isn't going to work. They're simply unable to accept it ideologically. Danny, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a really pertinent observation, and it's one that has a deep connection. There is a deep connection between this, let's say, American exceptionalism or even Western exceptionalism, because I think Western exceptionalism, this whole civilized burden that the West has adopted for centuries now on the rest of the world, it's making it an obligation to go around the world, colonize, dominate, assert hegemony, super exploit. I mean, these these aims need to be supported in many ways by a feeling of superiority or an ideology of superiority, because how else can you explain this phenomenon? Most people do not want to hear or see, especially in the modern era, especially if we think of 2023, they don't want to hear things like, well, we just killed 1 million people because you stole their because we wanted to steal their resources, right? For example, the case of Iraq. Most people don't want to hear that. But if you can tell people, well, that country has a dictatorship, we are superior to that, we have a democracy, and we're bringing democracy there, then people are probably more likely to support or at least look the other way. And the same thing has happened with these attacks on Russia and China. They're deemed authoritarian or autocracies, dictatorships, against the rule of law, all of these things. They're, high technology in China is subverting national security, all of these wild claims, these Cold War claims. And all of it serves to make these countries out to look and sound evil. But the problem now, and what makes this moment different than, let's say, 1945, or makes this moment different even than, let's say, post-Civil War United States, is that a country like China, a country like Russia, both of them are able to subvert sanctions, are able to move forward in ways that undermine these kind of policies. And it really does back the United States and its Wall Street, dominated political system into a corner. Because if you think about it, when you have Huawei's Mate 60 Pro be released, and then this announcement that government officials are not allowed to use iPhones because of the security breach, which is actually a really legitimate concern,
Yes,
given how much is known from what the NSA and other intelligence agencies has done to tap into this kind of technology, and literally use these phones as rove wiretapping systems, etc. When there is this actual security concern, it's not a surprise. But the fact that it can have this impact on a corporation like Apple, this alone, these two developments alone, because I don't think it's just the government ban the Chinese officials not using these phones. I think it's them together, Huawei moving forward, subverting sanctions, and that's leading to Apple having increased anxiety about their own market share. It's a vicious cycle. The more that the United States weaponizes its economic system, the dollar, sanctions, etc., against a country like China, the more China is going to pursue self-reliance and pursue sovereign development, and literally continue to strengthen the Made in China initiative, which is an initiative in China to ensure that domestic production not only strengthens, but actually becomes the dominant mode of production in China. Foreign investment, while very important, and China continues to open up and continues to want it and seek it, that it's going to be Chinese industries that are protected, and thus the interests of Chinese people that are protected. So accelerating that process through sanctions only means that competition ramps up, and monopolies like Apple don't generally like competition. They want to be the single game in town. They want to dominate all of the components, the supply chains. And this is why, this reality is why the United States has never accepted China's economic development path, and it will never accept it, because this is a foregone conclusion. There was always an understanding that China wasn't just going to allow the United States and collective West to do what it's done on the African continent and Latin America, et cetera, come in, basically steal all the markets, dominate them, loot and plunder them, and then also enforce its financial system and its political system over it. China was never going to allow that. And every country that does a similar kind of thing, resist this domination, is treated the same way. And it's just that in China, they've met their match. And things like the Huawei Mate Pro 60 is just the tip of the iceberg. It really is. And so why this continues to occur is Washington has no other option. If they pull back, if they look weak on China, then they're going to anger incredibly powerful forces that believe that China's future and it is only allowed to develop in a manner that fits their interests. Those are the forces on Wall Street and the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies. Those forces, those billionaires that don't see eye to eye with China's development model, like George Soros. It's these forces that want to see China not just open up; they want to see China be completely and utterly humiliated again. They want to see China under their thumb. It's a fantasy, but that's exactly what they want, and it's why they provoke and promote this feeling of superiority as much as they can.
And Angela, I want to hear your take as well. And I agree with all of that, Danny. I want to add that when you see people in America say, I'm not racist, I love the people of Taiwan, but they love people on Taiwan because they eagerly subordinate themselves to white Western civilization. And this is the same that you see with Japan. They're like the honorary white country that is in Asia, sort of. But then again, if you're in Japan on a U.S. Marine base and the Japanese guy leaves the room, then you hear what everyone really thinks about Japan. And so there's that. I think there is a racist component to this. I think it's at the core. I think it goes all the way back into history, and I think it's still very much a reality. They just have to, just like you say, they have to be more careful. They can't say, I want to go into Iraq because I want to control the global oil markets. I don't want them working toward de-dollarization. I don't want an independent foreign policy in Baghdad. Angela, what is your take on all of this? Why do you think they know that it's not going to work, but they won't pull back and find a constructive role to play among nations? They still insist on imposing themselves on the world. Why is that? Why do you think that is?
I think there's a mix of reason. I think arrogance, ignorance. I think when we face them, there are two ways. We have different type of person that we are going to come across when it comes to this arrogance and this willingness to go and hit the wall, because that's what's going to happen. There's two things. One is just and just always by being factual. It's morally wrong to contain 80-90% of the world. It's morally wrong. Especially for people that are self-proclaimed humanistic. What we call the latte liberal. Where this come from? The latte liberal. It's those people that told the woke liberal. They are at the Starbucks and they are talking about the plight of Africans. While we are actually the ones that made that situation of poverty, which is inhumane. So I would say this one side is by being factual, just make people understand that this is morally wrong. And then for the one that are really arrogant, I think we can have a very plain talk. I don't know who said that, but I think it was Genghis Khan. He said, never go into a fight if you're not sure to win. In reality here, we are facing an adversary that is stronger and that has a very strong determination. What happened in the collective West is that average Joe, he has a contact, especially in the US. In Europe, it might be different because Europe had, they suffered more when it comes to World War II, But when was last time that the US had a war on their ground? People don't have any memory. I mean, they don't have the trauma that you have in Russia and China. I I can tell you that if you touch Taiwan in China, most parents in China, they would say, you know what, I'm willing to give up my son to go fight for this. Russia, the same. Russia, if you are touching this, the sovereignty of China, Russia, you want to balkanize Russia, I tell you, they'll be willing to fight. Now, I tell you, when I see that generation, cosmopolitan generations, latter liberal, you tell them, you are going to fight all the way to Taiwan. You know what? The first thing they do, they'll take a flight ticket, they'll go to Tijuana or they go to Bali. They're not. Why would you fight? You know, it's a generation. It's sad. I mean, you know, there's a generation which is like, but they did on purpose, huh? You know, enslaved. You know, drugs, alcohol. You know, you feed them with Netflix, porn. You know, and you divide them, and it gets really messy. Those guys are not going to fight. But that was the purpose again. You know, it's they are deconstructing society. So you have people they become passive. They're in a survival mode. Those ones are not going to fight. They're not going to fight. You know. So here you want to go into a home which is very solid in terms of foundation, family, religion, love of country, and that's their home. You know what? No chance, and they're hardworking. You know what? And they know their history. That's the thing. You go to a Chinese and you talk about containing them. They had hundreds of years of humiliation. You know what? They've been working for 100 years to get to this day. You know what? But there's no resentment. I'm not going to mess with you. I know what you did in history. But I'm not going to mess with you. But don't mess with me. And just history. Just look at history. Chinese history. I repeat it over and over. Why do you think they did the Great Wall? Because they were invaded many times and they don't want to be invaded. And they are self-centered. They're self-centered. You know, for Chinese, and you know, they love their country, patriotic and so on. And it's all about China. For the rest, well, you know, let them. I don't care what happened there. I want stability and I want to do trade and do business. We have to accept they are different, but they're not messing with us. Look at how many US Army bases are around in Southeast Asia. They're everywhere. 800 all around the world. They have encircled China. Additional to that, we did it on the show many times. I mean, how many countries they've been messing around because they want to create chaos, or they want to have vassal states that are going to fight the US wars against China. How many? You know, they tried with Cambodia, with Laos, with Thailand, with Myanmar, Malaysia, everywhere. They messed up, including within China, in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, and in Beijing.
Taiwan.
In Beijing, 1989, you know, the attempt of color revolution. In Taiwan, 2004, right? Oh, I missed 2014, Sunflower Revolution. Yeah. So we need to stop that. We need to stop. And you know, madness is keeping doing the same thing and expecting different result. That's what we're doing. It didn't work, you know. But you know, actually, there was Einstein quote, but Einstein is an even better quote. You are not going to solve a problem with the same mind that has created the problem. The problem is the mind. Did you get that?
Yeah.
You're not going to solve a problem with the same mind that has created the problem. The mind. Because you try to solve the problem with the same mind, that the problem is that mind. Change that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that really is that last quote is at the very heart of it. It is the Western mindset. The people in Washington, on Wall Street, London, Brussels, their mindset, and you hear them talking every single day. You just turn on the news and listen to them talk. I was listening to the head of trade that was in China when they announced the Mate 60 Pro. The things that they say, they are disconnected from reality. And we always ask, or at least I always ask people that come on the live stream, you know, are these people lying? Are they knowingly lying, or do they actually believe this? And sometimes it is very convincing that I almost believe that they honestly think these things in reality. Now we have some time for some if people have some questions, please ask. I saw a question. It's way up high. I cannot find it now, but it was about Vietnam. The U.S. trying to, just as Angelo was saying, the U.S. is going into all of these countries trying to recruit a united front against China, and they're in Vietnam, and people have this sense that Vietnam is anti-China, but in actuality, China built one of Vietnam's first metro lines. I think it's in Ho Chi Minh City. They also have given Vietnam access to China's Chinese Europe railway, so they can send products from Vietnam across Eurasia to Europe. So there's a lot of cooperation there also. Same goes for India. People perceive India and China as adversaries. I don't think everything is 100% cooperative there, but I also think it's not as bad as we're told. What do you think about this, Danny? Do you have any insight into any of that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm actually I'm going to Vietnam in October, in about a month or so, and hopefully I'll be able to ask some of these questions too. But when it comes, this is a question I'm often asked: is Vietnam on the side of the United States against China? Is this working? And I think the short answer is no. Vietnam has made it very clear that it's not going to get caught up in a Cold War. And as you said, Brian, China-Vietnam relations economically in terms of cooperation are actually quite robust, from that transit system that was built in Vietnam. It's the very first ever public transit system, to the fact that a cooperation along the Belt and Road Initiative, which Vietnam is a member of, has also increased dramatically. And this isn't just restricted to economic cooperation. Politically, after the 20th Congress of the National Congress of the Communist Party of China, Vietnam's General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam was one of the first diplomatic visits that occurred afterwards. And actually, despite the fact that Joe Biden is going to visit Vietnam in sometime within the next month, the China-Vietnam relationship is being talked about as one that is strengthening, and a partnership that is very broad in scope, and one that also shares a value system commonality, to countries that are along a very similar path. Actually, it's a strikingly similar path when it comes to opening up, reforming the economy, to increase and boost prosperity. These are things that China and Vietnam agree with wholeheartedly. So it is really another failed project, and it is going to fail because there is no erasing the history that the United States has in Vietnam. You know, earlier when Angela was talking also about the militarization of Asia and of the Asia Pacific, when it comes to, like, let's say Taiwan, if a conflict was going to be sparked there, the reality is that if you just look at right now, China and the DPRK are holding pretty deep talks for the second time in a matter of months. China sent a delegation, a government delegation, which includes the vice premier of China, to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the DPRK. And if we remember, in 1950, there's a whole movie about this that China made called The Battle of Lake Changjin. It's 2 parts. Highly recommend it. But China sent millions of volunteers to fight on the side of the DPRK in order to help Korea liberate itself from Japanese, and of course, at this time, it was the United States invasion of the country. So China has a long history in this region as being the opposite of a colonizer and an imperial power. And Vietnam, despite having differences with China that date all the way back decades and decades ago, it is well known that Chinese cooperation, economic cooperation and diplomatic and political, all of that is too important to pass up, too important to maintain for whatever the United States is offering. And so when you look at Vietnam's political relationship with the United States, it is one of pragmatism. It is one that acknowledges the fact that there is no getting around when the United States comes to you. You're going to have to deal with the United States. And Vietnam has an experience of sanctions for many, many years after the war. It hampered its development. And so similar to China, when China normalized relations with the United States, Vietnam has done the same thing and has attempted to gain whatever benefits it can, but it will not be dragged into a major conflict. That's why the two countries have made a pretty deep commitment to continue not just to build stronger ties economically, but to show the world that they are not at any kind of odds that at all hamper increasing cooperation and solidarity with each other. So it's another failed project on the way. No matter if Biden goes there, Kamala Harris, and anyone they want, the message is going to be the same, that Vietnam's not going to get into a Cold War and that it's not going to be turned into some kind of launching pad for a war with China.
And again, just as you said, China has much more to offer all of these nations here in Asia Pacific. What does the US have to offer? And the only way they can get countries to side with Washington against China in a very irrational way is to overthrow a government, install a client regime, and have them make these irrational decisions to cut economic ties with China, even though it'll crater the economy, just like Ukraine did, just like they're trying to get Taiwan to do, again, even though it's not a country, but it's the same concept. I saw another question about Thailand, anti-China protests in Thailand. Yes, these are U.S. government-funded opposition groups coming out to the streets. Angela and I, for like years now, we used to do live streams during the daytime here in Asia, covering these U.S. mobs, and they will. Angela, you remember they had like signs that say, "We want Pfizer, we don't want Sinovac." I mean, it's so transparent and childish, but people, there's still groups of people that fall for it, and they can still create instability. And I don't know when Southeast Asia will turn the corner and finally be able to protect their sovereignty individually as nations and regionally as ASEAN. I really hope that day comes where it's like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or now we see BRICS expanding. Actually, some ASEAN nations are getting into BRICS, so we'll have to wait and see. I'm looking for some other questions. Angela, you have anything to add to these points that we're making?
I'd like to add one thing. I mean, I think with the Ukrainian war and the attitude, I mean, the Putin facing strong the collective West, we have reached a new paradigm. Everything is changing from now on, and we've seen so many shifts we would never have expected. To give an example, how many, all those US partners that actually didn't go along with the sanctions. You had Saudi Arabia turning its back against the US. You had many examples like this. Just the fact that how many countries actually started to bypass the US dollar. Remember, because of wanting to ditch the dollar, you had Saddam Hussein who died for that. You had Gaddafi who died for that. Now, they all dare to do that. What is happening right now in Africa, don't you think it's related to what is happening in Ukraine? It is, because they are being emboldened. Now, they know that if they need weapons or some help, maybe Russia is coming at the rescue. Before that, nothing would happen. Now, they go into Vietnam. You know what? Vietnam, they see it's shifting. It's shifting. You have all those NATO countries that cannot beat Russia. They're losing actually against Russia. They are emboldened. So now, remember how many times they went along the US, not because of being partners or friends, because the tactic was threatening. And it didn't work. You see where it didn't work? It didn't work, for example, with Saudi Arabia. Remember, Biden called Saudi Arabia, we are going to make you a pariah state. Pariah state.
Great way
That's,
to win friends.
Super smart. Very smart.
you know, and they killed. I mean, that was the killing of the petrodollar right there. So the US, up to now, it was always threatening, including its friends, including its strongest, closest allies. It's not working anymore. So now they need to find another way, because the strong way didn't work. You need to stop that. Especially when you used to be stronger, that was okay. Well, you have to go along, because otherwise, I don't want to end up like Gaddafi. But now you're no more the strongest one. You know what? You need to find other strategy, because it's not working.
Okay. Okay. So, and yes, obvious. Like, this is a reoccurring theme. The U.S. and its allies, their strategy is not working, but they refuse to change the premise where all of these bad strategies are branching off from. I had another question about these Storm Shadow cruise missiles that the UK and France, and there's a German version that they may or may not be sending. Probably they'll send some to Ukraine. What is the status on these? These require warplanes to take off, launch them in the air. They can only do that so many times per mission. Russia has a huge air defense network. Unless you fire many all at the same time, you're unable to overwhelm Russian air defenses. So many of these are going to be intercepted, or they will face electronic warfare and go off course. And even if they hit their targets, they're just too few, too far between to make any actual impact on Russian combat power. They can replace their combat power much faster than Ukraine can take it away, versus Russia's ability to send cruise missiles every single night, Garan 2 drones every single night, Iskander ballistic missiles. This is a mismatch. And so that's the story with Storm Shadow. There's another question about Australia. Will Australia get dragged into this? So this is a question I actually want to hear from Danny and Angelo. I saw that there's going to be a visit by the Australian Prime Minister to China, first time in years. But at the same time, the US is desperate to drag Australia in, to use Australia as a regional Ukraine, to militarize them, transform them into a national security threat for China, and to recruit them into activities in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, in a different part of the globe from where Australia is. Yes, they're kind of in Asia, but they're in the southern, they're south of the equator, so they're not really in that area. So, Danny, what do you think the future of Australia looks like regarding its relationship with the U.S. and China?
Well, it's gotten more complicated, even just as you mentioned, Brian. Even just the last 24 hours or so, I think actually the Prime Minister, Albanese, Australian Prime Minister, he has met with high-level Chinese officials, and how it's usually portrayed is that this is a very positive step. Usually that's how China portrays it. Australia is going to China on its hands and knees, because what has happened is that in all of this hand-wringing that the United States has done toward Australia and trying to squeeze every bit of political capital from Australia in its war path against China, is that it's damaged Australia's political and economic legitimacy greatly. Because
just a moment, Danny. I want to show people this is Australia's trade with other countries. This is their exports. Look at that. I mean, like, I was just shocked seeing how big that is. That is huge. And then even imports. So Australia's biggest trade partner is China, and yet the U.S. is pressuring them to adopt a belligerent foreign policy against their largest, most important trade partner. It's madness. Please continue, Danny. Sorry.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to get into. That in both imports and exports, China is by far Australia's biggest partner and most important economic partner. So the fact that Australia is in everything in its power to essentially, quote unquote, decouple from China, to the point where China had to actually enact restrictions against Australia because the treatment was getting absolutely out of control, with Australia joining these military pacts like AUKUS, and also Australia being at the forefront of the propaganda war on China. Australia has a misinformation apparatus, a tabloid apparatus similar to the United Kingdom, and also has think tanks like the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which are incredibly important, funded by the Australian Department of Defense, funded by the US Department of State. Like, these institutions are key in provoking a hostile environment toward China. So all of this together, the militarization of Australia, Australia has long been essentially a junior partner, a client state of the United States for many, 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 many years now. And as the United States has decided to ramp up its posture towards China, to get more aggressive, to focus on containment, it has taken Australia right down with it. And now we see a kind of break here where Australia just can't take it anymore. They are moving in a direction of wanting a more robust relationship with China, because there really is no other way. Whether Australia will do anything in the way of actually making that happen is probably unlikely. Maybe there will be some attempts to like right now, what they're saying is, hey, China, can you ease some of these curves on exports and imports that you put on us because of our bad behavior, so that we can increase trade? But it's unclear Australia will give anything in return in order to make that happen, because we've seen this time and again with the United States. They have these so-called diplomatic conversations, and then they go back right afterward to doing business as usual, increasing sanctions, increasing military provocations, diplomatically saying one thing during the meetings, and then afterward lecturing China, insulting China, demeaning China. So all of that is par for the course with the entire collective West. And so Australia has no other choice but to try to repair its relationship with China. Whether it has the political capacity to do that is probably highly questionable, because of its relationship to the United States and how the United States just does not allow its client states to do anything except be more rabidly provocative toward China, toward Russia, etc. That's the position that countries like Australia, the European Union countries, have been pushed into, and that's one that they've largely embraced up until certain points, like today, literally the conversation we're having right now.
Yes, and just to add on to that, the question is, the U.S. is the real enemy of Australia. Yes, Australia's biggest threat right now is the United States of America. It is the nation threatening Australia's best interests the most. And Danny mentioned ASPI, and this is their annual report from 2021. All of these governments fund ASPI. So when they're talking about China bad all day, every day, it's because the U.S. State Department pays them to do that. Now, I was gonna, you kind of answered the question. I was going to ask it. Maybe Angelo, you take a shot at this. The best thing for Ukraine to do, they can't afford to be anti-Russian. The best thing for them to do is to trade with Russia, to cooperate with Russia, rebuild their industrial capacity, which was deeply tied to Russia and collapsed when they irrationally cut ties with Russia from 2014 onward. That's obviously the best thing for them to do for their best interests, but they're obviously not doing that. They're doing the opposite, and they are on a path to self-destruction. And Danny was just saying how Australia has no other choice but to work with China, and it doesn't. There's no reason not to. And the question is, but are they? And can they? Is there even a possibility for them to do this, Angelo?
Well, the problem is that perception is very important here. And how do you shape perception? You know, it's this whole thing about what Noam Chomsky calls manufacturing consent. You know, when you are hammered, not only, you see, there's the deepest one is probably on, on ethnically, in a sense that, all those movies that you see on Hollywood, it's Russian was never the cool guy, Chinese was never a cool guy, was always like obscure, So you have that, but additional to that, you have the media hammering all the time China threat. You wouldn't, even good things that turn into bad thing. It's just the story, like I think it was BBC. The she was complaining. The journalist was complaining. Chinese trains are too fast. Because of being too fast, we cannot enjoy the ride. I'm like, what are you saying? I mean, really? And it's over and over. So you are hammered. And now when you look at the polls, perception of China, China has become the biggest threat. But this is how that's how you do. You shape the perception. And politicians, if you want to be elected, because the perceptions have been shaped already, you have to go along. So now, you have the rational will be like, well, I'm supposed to bring prosperity to my country, but then you need to be re-elected. So you need to do some virtue signaling. You need to go there and say stupid things about Chinese human rights, and because it's virtue signaling, but ultimately it's shooting yourself in the foot. It doesn't make any sense. So the problem is that the perception, again, the media, the information space, plus you have so much money being poured from NGOs. You it's it's the strategy of the loser. Because you cannot compete, then you have to. I mean, we've seen that as kids, right? Kids, you cannot compete. So either you are going to make sure the person doesn't compete at all, or you are going to do to say, well, oh, he cheated, he cheated, or bad publicity and so on. And that's what the West is doing. See, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Congress had to issue a bill of $500 million on bad coverage, to do bad coverage about the Belt and Road Initiative in China. Why do that? Why don't you compete? That's the strategy of a loser. That's the one that doesn't accept he's losing, and he's going to tell everybody, oh, he cheated, or he did whatever, or it's crazy, just crazy.
It is. It's an entire nation state, or even region of the planet, the West, the collective West, with almost a childish mindset. You see these articles, the trains are too fast. I even saw one, they're curing cancer too quickly. It's like, how is that possible? And you go Google that. It's there somewhere. I didn't believe it either, and then I looked it up.
It's a collection. There must be a collection. I'm sure we can track.
I think there's a Twitter account, at what cost, China at what cost, or something like that. Yes, and you also see, and in all seriousness, you also see the collective West saying the only way China is surpassing us is because they're stealing our intellectual property. Just like you say, Angela, they're cheating, they're stealing our intellectual property. There's no way those people can come up with these things on their own. They have to be taking it from us because we are the best. And obviously no one can be better than us. So how could they possibly be doing it? And these are people who are in charge. They're at the top of Western society. They are running countries and corporations, and they have this very troubling mindset. Well, we're past an hour and a half. I think we covered a lot of grounds. Danny, is there anything else you want to add to that, or is there any other topic, if you want to, that you want to talk about before we wrap things up?
No, not in particular. I mean, similar to the strategy of a loser, we have Indonesia is about to unveil, or I think it's now in operation, the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway. And as Angela was talking, it made me think about all of the attacks on China's high-speed rail that are being ignored around the world. I mean, this rail line in Indonesia is going to cut, I think, what was a 3 to 6 hour car ride, a disastrous, nightmarish travel situation for ordinary people in Indonesia, into a 40-minute train ride, and just how impactful that's going to be. But you can imagine that given all of the attacks on high-speed rail in China, what is often talked about is, oh, they go too fast. Oh, they aren't made that well, or oh, they just aren't profitable, so they're really just a money suck, and that you're just going to end up hurting your economy, when nothing could be further from the truth. The Belt and Road Initiative Forum is coming in October, and the data from the World Bank that has come out, I think it was around 2019, they released a report that said that by 2030, you're going to see massive reductions. I think somewhere between 8% for extreme poverty and over 15 to 20% for moderate poverty for Belt and Road countries who implement projects just like this one. So the benefits are very real. There's over $1 trillion. There's going to be a diplomatic kind of blemish, a black eye for the United States and the collective West when Vladimir Putin is the star of the show, sitting in the Belt and Road Forum on his first visit since the so-called ICC arrest warrant. All of this is just pointing to the fact that no matter how much the United States tries to insult, the collective West tries to insult and demean and propagandize about China's success and its progress around the world and its cooperation and its multilateral projects, that it cannot hide the fact that these projects show that the United States is indeed losing its influence, its hegemony, and ultimately its ability to compete as the Belt and Road Initiative and BRICS and all of these multilateral mechanisms show, whether they're led by a particular country like China or Russia, or whether they are in fact multilateral mechanisms run by several countries. It doesn't matter. All of them show the same thing. They show that the United States is falling behind. It'll continue to fall behind, and it will continue to depend on wars and proxy wars like Ukraine. It'll continue to militarily encircle Russia and China. It'll continue to do whatever it can, sanctions, maybe assassination attempts on political leaders in Niger that they don't like. It'll continue to do all of these things for the same purpose, which is to maintain what is a foregone conclusion, a declining hegemony, dominance around the world that will not be resuscitated now or in the future.
Well put. It is a system whose time has come and gone, and it cannot survive today in this multipolar world. I'm glad you actually brought up the high-speed rail and this claim that it's not profitable. And this is what they said about the high-speed rail when China was building their own network. They went from no high-speed rail at all to the largest high-speed rail network on Earth by far. And there are some routes that are very profitable, and there's others that aren't at all. And the problem that the West has is they look at only that in a very short-sighted way. Even if you're being greedy, if you zoom out and you look at the value, not the revenue, but the value that infrastructure has overall for your economy, is actually going to boost the overall value and revenue of your entire economy. So this is part of this process, as Angela said, purpose over profit, but also having a wider vision than just, does this route make money? If not, let's cut it out. It's like a person that plays checkers versus someone who's playing chess, who's trying to look several moves ahead to see what it's going to look like later, not just what it's going to look after I jump that person's checker. So I think that was a very good point that you brought up. And yes, they're building high-speed rail. China is building high-speed rail across Southeast Asia, and it is having a tangible impact, a positive impact for the people living here. And what can the West do? They cannot compete. Angela mentioned Build Back Better World. They didn't have a fake project that they just made up, like a computer graphic of like some project. They didn't even bother doing that. It would be funny if it wasn't such a danger to this planet. Angela, do you have anything you want to add to that, or anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
To Danny just mentioned poverty alleviation in BRICS nation, to the Belt and Road Initiative. It's just amazing if people if the collective West just would learn about how China did You know, there's I think Li Jingjing, she did a documentary about this, but basically they dispatched thousands and thousands of consultants in the villages. And for Chinese, it was not about giving welfare to poor people. Was about how we can educate them, give them tools, and empower themselves. See, empower themselves. In the West, we have welfare. So basically, actually, you enslave people by giving them welfare. You know, it's just, you know, it's the same as how they destroyed Indian communities. You know, American Indian communities. We were like, you know what? Don't work. We're gonna give you money, and they ended up just drug addict and alcoholic. You know, China different. You know, and it's interesting how actually in all Eurasia, those countries are getting inspirations from what China did. Not only of poverty alleviation, but also terrorism. You know, we mentioned, you know, the West says camps. You know, in China they created vocational schools. They give tools. You know, they realize that terrorism, the root of terrorism, is poverty and lack of education. You know, so because you have lack of prospects, you become radicalized, and they tackle that. You know what? So they had job. You bring them prosperity, and that's how you do it. So I just feel that you know, very sad. I just wish that the West we could learn from China. We don't need to become China. You know, I'm not, you know, and I keep them repeating that over and over. It's not out of love from China. It's you know, it's the same as my relationship to my country would be the same as big brother, small brother. You care about your brother, but your brother is doing something really stupid, and you have to tell him. You know,
Yes.
but he's still my brother. So what where I'm angry is that those people that are arrogant, they're making a mistake. They care less about their country than I do. I might seem that I'm supporting China. It's not true. It's not true. My country is doing something really stupid. It's immoral, and it's a fact that cannot be won. So become adults. That's the word. Become adult, because those are kids. The way the leaders of the collective West, the way they're behaving is kids. We kiss each other, hugs, we're cool, we make a few pictures. That's not how you run a country. You don't need to be sexy, you need to deliver.
Well said. And you were talking about welfare in the West, and you hear a lot of critics, Western critics, saying, you know, China's a horrible communist country. It's socialist. It's communist. You know, I don't think they even understand what these words mean. And they say that when you do welfare in the U.S., you're just copying China. It's a horrible system. It controls everything. But I got this book from a colleague who gave it to me, and I was reading through it, and over again, this is a collection of Xi Jinping's speeches. He talks about how the key to raising up people is not handing them out anything. If you hand them something, hand them education, get them jobs. The key to getting out of poverty is education and hard work, and it's a common sense, and that's the problem in the West. There's a huge lack of common sense. And just one more thing I just want to put up here. China is different how they are resource grabbing and gaining ownership of the assets in the countries they develop. So how is China different than the West? Well, number one, they didn't show up with an army and eradicate a percentage of the population and then start building infrastructure so that they could cart the resources out. It's a completely different process. Ask yourself, where are you getting this idea that this is what they're doing? What media? Is it the same media that told you Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, or that Syria was gassing their people? And if that's your answer, then you're being lied to. They're building schools, they build power plants, they're building all of the infrastructure that the West, who dominated, say, a continent like Africa for generations, they are actually building the modern infrastructure that they have been denied all of this time. They are trying to create stability and economic progress within the country, because it's not just about resources, it's also about trade. That's what China does. They come to a country, they want to trade, they want to do business. They can't do that if the country's impoverished, divided, and killing themselves, killing each other. this debt trap diplomacy propaganda, because that's what it is. China forgives debt. That's something you will never see the West doing. And say here in Thailand, Thailand is paying for their high-speed rail project with China themselves. It's not through a loan from China. If China was just trying to grab and indebt all of these countries, why would they even allow that as a possibility? The IMF doesn't allow that to be a possibility. So maybe Danny and then Angela, please, how is I'll just put it up on the screen for reference. How would you answer this? People,
can I just quickly jump in, because I know quite well this topic. You know, there's only one time where China took one asset. China didn't take the asset. You know, it's the port in Sri Lanka, that issue. A lot of Western media, what they said was that China built the port, they lent the money, and then because it could not repay, then they took the port, which is not true. Now, let's be factual. China built the port upon the request of Sri Lanka. So there's a loan, and it's a long-term loan, which is actually percentage-wise, interest is half of what the IMF is giving for, you know, and then it's not conditional. There's no condition, but before that, they need to have a study of feasibility. So it needs to be making money over time. Okay. What happens that they build the port, they lend the money, but then there was an IMF loan that was actually due, and Sri Lanka didn't have that money. They went to China and they said, you know what, we need to pay that loan because otherwise we can go, you know, we are in a big trouble. And they say, you have the port that you built for us. We are going to give you as a leasing. I think it's 100 years. We lease you that port for 100 years and you help us pay that loan. What they did, the collective West, all the Western media, they said, you know what, you see, that's the good example. This is debt trap. They build something, then you have a loan, you cannot repay, I take the asset. That's factual. But you see, the problem is that in order to understand that, you need to spend 1 hour just to dig into being factual and so on. And all those Western media, they hear something from a think tank, which is completely wrong, and just repeat it. And that's it, that's over. And so that's the example, that single example of, you know, the Sri Lanka port. And I think there's Hussein Askari is actually, it gives a better information. I mean, all the details of this transaction. It's to you, Danny.
Danny, yes.
No, those are really great points. The port in Sri Lanka, great example. Another great example of this is the airport in Uganda. This airport, the Entebbe airport, in 2021 was reportedly, late 2021, was reportedly seized by China because China supposedly had a loan with Uganda to renovate and update this airport that wasn't paid. And this was a complete lie. Not only was the airport not seized, but if you just look at the details of this loan with a 20-year maturity and a 7-year grace period, one can understand that Uganda hasn't even had to pay a penny yet for these updates and renovations. Actually, Uganda was well within its right not to, because the terms of the loan were that there's a 7-year grace period before any repayment had to occur. So the lies become that much more ridiculous when it comes to so-called asset seizure, resource grabbing with China in regards to the rest of the world. Now, also, I think one thing to note here is that when this narrative of China resource grabbing is promoted, it often leaves out the countries in question. It leaves out what kind of self-determination, what kind of agency, what kind of decision-making process lies with the countries engaging in relations with China. Unlike the United States, unlike the collective West, which literally ensures through every single dealing it does, economically or militarily, that it is an uneven relationship. A cursory examination of anything China does around the world, any country, especially the global South, is that those terms, whether it's loans, whether it's infrastructure projects, etc., they are generally done in a manner that is supposed to be win-win. And generally they are win-win cooperation agreements. Both sides get a lot out of it. And countries that are incredibly impoverished, countries like Uganda, countries like throughout the African continent, Latin America, much of Asia, West and East, they want to develop their country using the resources that they have. And they want to ensure that if these resources are going to be developed, it's going to improve their domestic economies. And China offers that. China will build the factories that these resources can be developed in, so they can be used for actual commodities, for products, for higher end value goods. That is something the United States has never offered. If you look at even just any cooperation agreement or even just trade relations that China has with countries around the global south, you'll see that China does not just exporting its goods, but it does a whole lot of importing. And it's often the one building the infrastructure that allows landlocked countries in the African continent, for example, to be able to export its goods to a country like China. So that's the win-win. These countries end up with higher rates of economic development, better growth rates. They're able to modernize their economies to at least some degree in a time where you still have global South countries without electricity and without basic forms of infrastructure that you need to even run an economy at all. So, it is a ridiculous assertion to say that this is resource grabbing. Really what this is optimization. It's China saying, we will help you optimize your wealth and we will benefit from that because we'll be able to increase trade with you and we'll be able to gain advantages, and so will you. And that is the definition of win-win cooperation. It's not just a slogan. It's not just words. It is something that is time and again shown. There's a Djibouti-Ethiopia railway. We can go on and on and on. If you look at a map of the African continent, much of the connectivity that has occurred in that continent alone is because of China's investment there. It's because of China's commitment to helping African countries do this when the collective West has never shown any kind of interest. The collective West has only wanted to siphon resources from there and to develop its side. I mean, that's the whole basis for this conflict now that the collective West and especially France has with Niger.
Can I add just in one, because it's I don't want to miss that one because it's so good. It's this African leader who's talking to a journalist, and he's saying when China comes, they come and they build a hospital and schools. When Western leaders come here, they give us a lecture, and then they say, oh, but but China is they're here to make money and take advantage of you. And that's when you say, well, here comes the lecture.
Yes, and I'm going to show the map of the railways China is building in Africa. I'm going to add to all of this that when the West came to Africa, they came and they just took the resources out. They didn't pay them. They didn't build them projects in return. They took everything out. Anything that they built in Africa was to facilitate plundering these countries. And that this person said China is different. How? So I just explained how they are resource grabbing and gaining ownership of the assets in the countries they develop. And then a debate developed after this comment. And then they say, I did not say anything about seizing assets. Don't be disingenuous. This seems like somebody who's just repeating what they saw in the Western media. They don't really have a grip on what is really happening. I'm going to go to this map, and I'm going to say again, China's building infrastructure the West cannot build, and even if they could, would not build. They do not want to build these countries up. China is coming in and building these countries up. I was researching ECOWAS regarding the situation in Niger and the possibility of Nigeria leading a coalition into Niger as some sort of military intervention. And the only modern weapons any of these countries have is from China because the West wanted to keep them weak. And was it you, Angelo, who said that there were prerequisites when getting an IMF loan that you cannot invest in your military? purposefully keeping them weak so that anytime the US or Europe, France, the UK, any of these nations wanted to, they could just come in and knock everything over, like they did in Libya. Well, wasn't that was that you, Angelo, who brought that up?
Yeah, absolutely. In the preconditions, there's a prerequisite for loans from the IMF and the World Bank, is that you need to have extremely low ratio, like defense spending to GDP. So if you can actually, people can Google. You can Google actually on Wikipedia. You will see percentage of defense spending to GDP. Most of African countries have under 1%. To give you an idea, if you compare it to NATO prerequisite is 2%. But then keep in mind that those countries have large population and they are very poor. So that's nothing. Plus, additional to that, in terms of weapons, they can pretty much like give vetoes to the type of weapons they have, and they don't export. Actually, Western countries don't export on purpose to Africa, and up to now they were putting pressure on China and Russia to sell weapons to those African countries just to keep them weak. Exactly.
Yes. So we could go on and on and on. And like, I'm here in Southeast Asia. These countries are working with China. I've been here for 20 years, and I was here when the US and the West still held primacy over Asia before China began to rise. And I watched how the West just squatted on the entire region. They were not driving any development. The IMF came and plundered the region in the late 90s. When I got here in the early 2000s, they were still trying to recover from that. And the only time I started to see a real drive building, I had never seen so much infrastructure being built at one time. And I had not ever seen so much business being done, and factories and trade, from not just importing products from China, but exporting to China, as Danny was talking about. And that was all driven by China's rise, because China comes to a nation like Thailand, for example, and they do business in a completely different way. And I was at a meeting one time, and I saw the Chinese come in, and they had people that actually spoke Thai. They didn't come in speaking English like the West does. They come in, they speak English, and they expect you to speak English with them. They came and they spoke Thai with the Thai people in Thailand. And it's these little things that add up, that together with what we tangibly see unfolding on the ground, that tell you that they are doing business fundamentally different. Are they always going to do that indefinitely into the future? I don't know. But the multipolarism that they are deliberately setting up is a check and balance to any sort of future abuse that anyone in the future might be tempted to indulge in. So this is a big topic. I guess we could go into that very deeply. Does anyone have anything else to add? I said that before, but are we all satisfied with where the conversation has led so far? And then if so, well, we'll definitely have Danny back, and Angelo as well. Thank you so much, Danny, for coming on and sharing your insights. Always great. And Angelo, nice that you're back and you're more active on your channel as well. Danny, why don't you tell people where they can find, follow, and support your work?
Sure. So you can follow me, subscribe to my YouTube channel, Danny Haiphong, where I talk about very similar things, geopolitics, and Brian's been a regular guest. Definitely got to get Angelo on very soon. So you can follow me there. And of course, best social media area to follow me, best outlet would be Telegram. So you go to telegram.me/my name, Danny Haiphong, one word. And of course, you can support me. Go to any video. There's many various places. If you can't support financially, that's great. Monetarily, from Patreon, Substack, buy me a coffee, whatever is most convenient. You can go to the video description of any video on my YouTube channel and find all of those things.
Great. And both Danny and Angelo's contact information will be in the video description below. Because Danny is our special guest today, I will also put his information in a pinned comment at the top of the comment section. Because Angelo will be more active on his channel, I'm trying to convince him to do roundtables, and then maybe we could all get together over on his channel and get more in depth in these less structured, and just see where the conversation goes. So thank you again. Thank you everyone who tuned in live. And if you're watching this later on, please like and share. And as always, everyone, thank you for watching. And until next time, bye for now.